Welcome today on the brand new format of better backend software engineering. So today um, we'll be doing some live coding, and in particular, we'll focus on DDD, domain-driven design. This will most likely be a several-part video, so we definitely won't be able to cover everything in that single video. But the intent today is to still go over a few points and present you practically how DDD can be used, at least in my opinion, how I like to work with DDD. So give me a few seconds to move things around and we'll get started. Right, so today, what we're going to try to do is to build a very basic and simple example of a domain. And the domain is for basically the IT system of a library. This library has a pretty simple use case as of today. They have a catalog of books. Books can be searched by name, author, or ISBN. The library has a catalog of users, and the users can borrow books from the library. And a book can be in several states: available, borrowed, lost, or destroyed. A user can be in several states as well: active or banned, essentially. A book, when borrowed, must be returned by a certain date. A late return or no return will force us to ban the user from our library. When late, the book is marked as lost. And if the user returns the book after the return date, then the book will be reverted back to available. And lastly, if the book is returned in a destroyed state, the book will be marked as destroyed. So these are sort of the requirements that we're going to work with today. And before I move on to, actually drive this in more specific requirements, I want to instead go over what I have set up before going on this live. So there's not much really. We basically have a Spring application here. I don't even think it starts yet, actually. But we'll get over that in a later part, because today we're just going to focus on the domain strictly. And so we got a bunch of dependencies. Most of it we're not going to touch today. We'll go over it next time. So we also have like things to test. Again, we're actually not going to touch this today. The only thing here that we're going to use today is going to be Lombok. Right. So that's what we have here. The rest is just boilerplate created by IntelliJ directly. What I've created is an application class. And just the folders, not all of them, just the bare minimum, really. So what I put here is just like something I like to start with, which is essentially entity ID derived from required value and string ID. So, right, so all of my to basically implement some of this, and we might actually also create more of this later on. So we shall get started. So as I said earlier, the instructions are that we want to build this IT system for the library. And I'm actually going to switch to Markdown instead here, because we're going to drive requirements here. So I'll do this a bit quickly, and usually I would spend more time, but I already have some idea of how this works. Yeah, we have GitHub Copilot on, which is why there was this code suggestion there. So, so the library has a catalog of books. Well, this means first that we're eventually going to have to store books. So we will have to store this list of books, right? Most likely in a database. And we will also have to, well, over myself. So the next thing we know is that books can be searched by name, author, or ISBN. And so, at least for now, this means that we don't need a lot of things in our book, so we can start with the bare minimum. Books must have an ID, of course, name, author, name, author, and an ISBN. And for now, I think this will be all. We won't. Sorry, yeah. Well, this will be all for now. And in terms of, so the library has a catalog of users as well, right? So we will have to store the list of users in the database, indeed. And well, to start very simply, users must have an ID, a name, and well, a status as well. So next up, continuing on the requirement. So what we're being told here is that so a book can be in several states: available, borrowed, lost, or destroyed. So it means that something we need here is also a status. So author, sorry, I'm filling in the gap, and the status. Right. And so there is one thing here that I've actually forgotten. I'm going to go back on this. So books can be searched by name, author, or ISBN. So one thing with searching by author is that this practically doesn't. This probably won't work well if somebody just search an author name and would try to match every possible book based on that. Simply because this will likely be some sort of fuzzy matching, and well, of course, we want to normalize the database as well. So we want to make sure that this author has a bunch of information maybe associated to it and is always kept up to date and is always the same everywhere. So that means that we actually will probably need to we'll have to store the list of not users this time, but authors. I'm actually going to replace A by their database. I think it makes more sense in this context. And so I guess at this stage and for this requirements, we probably don't need to implement the author search, but eventually this would be a requirement as well. And so from there, we also have a few more things. So a book, when borrowed, must be returned by a certain date. A late return or no return will force us to ban the user from our library. So in order to always maintain a clear record in that regard, we're gonna have to store the all the in a separate table all the books that are currently being borrowed by users, because this will allow us to keep a record as well, in order for us to know exactly who had been borrowing which book at what time. And this will allow us to follow up properly on when a book should be returned and by who. So with that said, it means that we will have to store the list of ongoing borrowings in the database as well. And so then there's a bunch of conditions in terms of what we need to do based on that. So we'll get to that later. So with that said, we have an idea of 4 core objects that we're going to have in this application. We're going to need a record of both. We're going to need books. We're going to need authors. We're going to need users, and we're going to need borrowings. So how do we go on implementing this? So we're going to start by creating us a package for a book. I'm not completely sure if that should be in a core package yet, or if it should be part of a separate package, but we can move things around, and I like to just start things in a bit blurry way, and then complete them as we move on. So right, so we're gonna create this class. It's gonna be a book class, of course. We discussed it. It's gonna need to have an ID, and so we're going to create a class called book ID. Book ID will extend a string ID. There we go. And so I'm actually going to try to implement. Can I just implement? No, it doesn't want to today. That happens. So we're gonna make it private actually. You'll see why. This is the constructor that I am creating here. And we're going to accept UID directly since it is internal. We want our ID to be a UID. And yeah, so this is all it's going to do. And that's going to be like the method that we're supposed to create a book ID. In fact, we're actually, no, sorry, of course, no, this is a reserved word. How can we call this one? Generate, right, uid.random uid. So, well, on UID generation, we could think of better strategy to generate UIDs, but that will be a topic for definitely another time. Okay, so now we can, we can add our book ID. This is going to be a final variable, of course, because we are not going to allow it to be modified. So back to our instructions, we've actually said that we wanted the books to have an ID, a name, an author, an ISBN, and a status. So we're going to need to create a couple more classes. So that's the thing with DDD is usually it tends to lead you to have to create a lot of classes. But this is, in my opinion, a fine thing to do. It actually allows us to clearly separate codes properly. So the next thing we need, is book name. So here we're going to extend our required value. There we go. And this is our book name. So again, we're going to make this private, and we're going to have a public static book name off. Now, what I usually would be doing is that, yes, I would have a function indeed that validates the value, or yeah, well, we're going to do it this way today, which I will first call here, right? My bad, sorry. Let's do it a bit differently. We're going to call it right after the constructor, and we're going to not pass it any value here. 1 second. I need to check. Also, yes, so it has private access here, and that's because we need to call the get value in order to get access to it. Right. So With that said and done, so yeah, in that case, we're just validating the length, right? But we could also apply a regex or limit the characters that are allowed. For now, yeah, indeed, that's a very stupid implementation. For now, we are just going to add this very simple length validation that will be all. And that's more like to showcase the concept of validating your domain object and how you can easily do it within DDD to ensure that every time a book name is created, it is always valid. So now we have that one, we can add it to our book class. So the next thing we want to do here is, well, we need a bunch of other things, right? So we're going to need our ISBN and our status. So let's do that. Again, we're going to extend required value, give it a nice little constructor. Actually going to make this completely private. And again, we're going to have this, no, sorry, not that. We're going to have this validation method, right? Yeah, so, well, very good indeed. I didn't knew an ISBN cannot be longer than 13 characters long. Anyway, so again, now we can apply it there. No, I think this is actually wrong. We don't need to pass it. So there again, what's very nice about this is that you just need to instantiate your book ISBN, and at the core of the domain, it will perform the validation. You don't need to think anymore about it. This, you can just take it for granted. So there you go. You get your book ISBN. I actually would like to speed up a bit this part. Because I want to move on to a slightly more set of interesting things. But for now, we also need the author ID, right? And so I'm just going to very quickly just create the identifier for the author. We won't create the domain yet for the author. And so there again, actually, sorry, this is a string ID. In that case, it's a bit different. So there again, we are going to create our string ID and make it private. And this is going to accept a UID. Yes. And yes, we make a static function to generate one. So, okay, that's all we needed right there. And with that said and done, we can actually move on to put our author ID here. Now, something a bit more interesting that we can finally do now is to talk about the book status. So the book status is going to be obviously an enumeration. And so is this correct? Oh yeah, we don't have reserved at the moment. So these are the ones that we put in the instructions in the beginning. We're gonna just use that. And so right now it's just a pure enum, but we're gonna have to build in a state machine in there. So that's gonna be the next part that I want to showcase. So there we go. We got all of the initial parameters of our book class, and we could think of a lot more than this. There are a lot of other things we're going to probably need in the future, but for now we do not need them. So right now the constructor is public. This is probably fine, but what is probably going to happen is that as the domain evolves, we might actually need to make it private or package private. In general, like with DDD and especially with classes in the model, what I'm trying to do is to limit as much as possible the access to any function or method. This will avoid you a lot of issues in the future and make sure that only a specified set of functions can be called and can be used to modify your domain, meaning that your domain will stay correct and pure at all time. So with that said, the one thing that we're not going to take here is, well, book ID actually, and also the status. Why? So book ID, we're going to actually generate it like that. And in fact, now we know this is only happening here. We might actually, well, for now, I'll keep it public. Well, actually, no, reverting on this. I'm not going to keep it public for now. And the status, well, the status, obviously, we're going to initiate it to book status available, assuming like when we create a book, it means that we just added it to the library, it is available. Right. So now we can actually move on to the more interesting part. I'm going to close a few stuff right there. And 1 second. And so, yes. So book status, let's go back to this book status. So I said earlier that we need to implement a state machine. So let's do this. We're going to call it can move to. Can move to book status. So the way it works is pretty simple. Yeah, we're going to. So the switch is based on this. So let me just give you an example of how this would be called. So book status dot available. So let's say like this is my status, and I would call. So this is my current status. Actually, it would look more like this. This dot status dot can move to, and in that case, we're, for example, trying to check if we can move it to state borrowed, right? And so this function will tell us whether or not our book in its current state can be moved to a borrowed state. And so its current state here is available, and so it probably should, but that's not always going to be the same. So if the current state is available, then you can actually, I think we're going to return this switch condition. This will be more understandable. So we're going to base it on the status instead. The status best. So if you're trying to move something to available, these can only work if this was borrowed before, or as per this requirement that we had there, if this was instead lost. Sorry, of course. Return also, yes, okay, sorry. So yes, this is wrong syntax. Very bad. So if you want to move to the borrow state, well, this can only be possible if in the first place the book was available. There is nothing else that should be allowed. Sorry, and this should be this and not status. Now, if you want to move to lost on the other end, this means that you can only move to lost when the book was borrowed to start with. And similarly, you can only move to destroy, at least as of today, when the book was already borrowed. So with that said, I think we got our state machine pretty much up and running. So we are going to then expose a method, for now public, but then again, in the future, we probably actually do not want to make it public. But let's get back to this a bit later. So, so our book here is going to have this, well, set public method, which is going to be switch to status, switch status, or maybe update status. I'm not completely sold on that function name. Maybe I'll find something better later. Do not completely like it, but let's call it like that for now. So Yeah, so now we can simply call our status.canMoveTo function that we just wrote. Actually, here, yes, you get this. Thanks. So, yeah, I wanted to add a bit more data here in order to get a bit more clear error message if that ever happened. And yes, of course, the status of the book cannot be final. That actually makes a lot of sense. All the other they should never be modified ever. So, with that said, we now have a way to move the book from. So, in DDD, there is this concept of aggregate object. We basically have a core object with sub items, and to just update the root aggregate object. Now, in our case with the library, this is not exactly the case because of one thing, which is that well, eventually the system will probably, at a bigger scale, it will probably be separated in several microservices. Obviously, it doesn't make sense in my example. That is not even the question. But what that means is that in that context, then it doesn't make sense to update a book and its author at the same time. What makes sense on the other end is to update a book or to update an author, these two actions separately. So, so the author itself should probably not be part of the book, at least not at this point, which is why we just have this identifier. This is a decision we could revisit later. However, what it would probably have is borings. I'm really not sure about this naming, by the way. I would like to find something better, but we're gonna call it borings for now. Actually, I'm even going to put it as part of the book package in that case, because it will be part of the same aggregate. So there we go. We're gonna create this class. We're gonna call it a boring, and for now it's completely empty. But the next thing our book class is going to have is a borrowing. Sorry, not a borrowing. A list of borrowings. Now, well, we might want to reconsider whether it should be a list, because it could grow pretty big as a list. Maybe like the book is going to be rented like 200 times over this over his lifetime, and you might not want to fetch all of these borrowings from the database every time you are fetching a book. So this might not actually be a very good idea, but for now, I'll keep on with this approach until we get a better idea. So I'll probably be switching it. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to instantiate the borrowings as not a list of, because this is going to create problems, but we're going to make it an array list. We want it to be mutable, of course, which is why a list.of would not work. So with that said, we now have our book aggregate right there. Again, I'm really challenging whether or not boring should be a list, or maybe we should just show there the last borrowings. That would be more reasonable. But given now we do not have really this constraint of optimization and performances, we can be a bit more loose. So I'll go with the list for now. And we will revert on this decision if we need to. So, so we could go and design what's inside this borrowing class. But one thing I would like to do instead for now is to look at the user class. So again, like, you do not touch a user at the same time as you touch an author. And definitely if you were in a microservice environment, then you would anyway have separated microservice for both. You would touch user aggregate at a different point in time. So we are going to create a user class here, and I'm going to make it as simple as possible. We again want a user ID, and we're going to create our constructor. Yes, this is exactly what I wanted. Thank you. We're going to make it private again. No, in that case, we actually do want a UID. I'm going to call it ID, id.toString, and UID dot random UID. Right. So this is our user ID. So our user is going to have a user ID. We're going to call to give them a well, let's call it username right now. Well, I actually don't quite like the term username because in that case, I think we're going to call it full name. Why is because username sounds like a website's username, whereas in that case, we're just talking about the name of the user, the actual real name. So again, we're going to do the same old trick. I'm actually going to call it name. I prefer that. So again, we're going to make a public static class that instantiated and have a validation function get value. Well, okay, here just checking the length. Again, I would definitely add more validation rules. A regex, probably making sure that this is a name. But as things stand right now, I'm just trying to make things simple and instead showcase how and what you can do with DDD. So in that case, there again, you just create your full name. You can take it for granted that it's going to be validated just by merely just instantiating it. So with that said and done, this is what our user is going to have. We might imagine that the user is going to also have a list of borrowing, but right now we put this aggregate into the book instead. Duplicating it would be definitely a bad practice. We cannot have two aggregates owning the same entities. So we are simply not going to do that. However, what we want next is just user status. So as I said earlier, we basically can have only two user status as the requirement, as far as the requirement goes. Sorry, this should be an enum, and it's active or banned. Right, and what we're going to do there, we actually don't need this. What we're going to do is that, so our constructor is just going to take full name and is going to instantiate ID2 exactly like that. Great. And so what you can is, no, not update status, but what you can do is ban user. And this will just, so if the user status is already banned, then, well, you cannot ban a user that is already banned, and otherwise you would just mark the user status as, actually, sorry, I don't like the name. It should be just status within this object. That would be much simpler. And we're just going to mark the status here as banned in that case. Yes, of course, it's final, and it shouldn't be. It's a state. So there again, I made a mistake. Happens all the time. So there could be a bunch of things just like last updated that and etc. And we could go on to, or created that, and we could go on to how to implement this in DDD. But right now, I do not want to. I don't want to do this at this stage. So what we're going to do is we're going to put getters. So this is done with Lombok. It's very convenient. I'm actually going to do this on book as well. So yeah, so now we get book user, very convenient. And the last thing we want to populate is boring. So a boring is gonna have it's gonna have an instance borrowed at, right? It's also, yeah, it's going to have return that state, which is nullable, of course, because in the beginning you haven't returned that. Returned due at. So this is the date at which you must have returned the book. So by the way, for those watching live, feel free to ask questions if you do have any. So moving on. So yeah, and aside from dates, of course, what you want to have here is going to have, well, you are going to need to know which book ID is being borrowed and which user is borrowing it. Now, on top of this, you also want an ID for this borrowing. And the reason is simply that that potentially the same user can run the same book several times. Nothing prevents us from doing this. So in terms of uniqueness, we're going to need a separate ID to store this in the database. So just going to very quickly create this ID. All right, so yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to do. No, actually, no, this is not. Again, we're gonna make this a UID. Yeah, ID, yeah, that's good. ID dot to string, and again, we're gonna create it like that. Cool. So, and that's the last bit that we wanted to have here. We wanted our borrowing ID. So, now with that said and done, we are now going to create the constructor, and the constructor is going to basically not have anything. We're going to do things very simply. You'll see how and why. So we want to generate the ID. Of course, we want to consider that it's borrowed at the instance. Let's yeah, make sure that we're using UTC. Good practice always. That it's borrowed at the moment when the object is created, and thus that it's due at, well, 60 times 60. So that's 1 hour, 1 day, and this is 30 days. Yeah, that sounds good. Let's say 60 days even. Let's be gracious. So you have to return the book within 60 days. Cool. Return that obviously is going to be null. And yeah, so at getter. So the next thing we want to do is perhaps is to register the function that will allow us to borrow from the book itself, from the aggregate. So the way we're going to do this is, well, this function is going to return a borrowing, and borrow, that's how it's going to be called, and it takes as a parameter the user ID. So, okay, this was auto-generated code. Is it any good at all? So let's see. It checks the status, indeed. So this is indeed needed. If the book is not available, you cannot borrow. And then it's going to create the borrowing and add it. And it's going to update the status to borrowed. Now, another check which we might want to have is to check if there is any ongoing borrowing. And if there was one, then we would not allow this change. However, the problem with this approach is that this would mean, because the status would have to be available to get to this check, this would basically mean that in the first place, you managed to move the book status to available, while it was actually it was actually being borrowed. So this is not good at all. So instead, it looks like this check should be somewhere else. So it should actually be in this update status. So the way we're going to do this is that we're not going to allow somebody to pass the status to available. And the reason for that is simply that instead, we want to do this into a separate function. I'll show you in a second. So first, we're gonna have this update status internal function. So this is the public one, and the public one doesn't allow you to move the book to available. But it also do not let you move the status to borrowed directly. In fact, I think I think this function should actually never be public. So let's go back to that. Update status, same as before, but it's a private function. So let me show you how we're actually going to be switching to new states. So typically, yes, exactly. So return book, for example. So say you're returning this book. So first we're going to try to find it. We're actually going to extract to another function, find get borrowing or throw. For now private, but we might actually need it at some point. And so in that case, we want to, call the function return book. That's a good call. I'm going to implement this in a second. And indeed, we want to update the status of the book itself to available. So you do not need to call directly update status. Instead, you just need to, in your application layer, which we'll talk about later, and not today, you will just need to update the status of the book to, you just need to call the method return book. And that's the very convenient thing with aggregates, is that you can apply functions that are complete, that will check everything and will make sure that your domain objects remains pure and correct at any point in time. Because the validations, all the domain logic, all the business logic, not all the business logic, but all of the core validation belongs to the domain itself. Everything that is related to making sure your entities are in a valid state. And now when it comes to orchestrating that, this is the responsibility of the application layer, not anymore the domain itself. So, right. So you can borrow a book, you can return a book. So let's just call this function return book. So return book is going to return that to now. First, it's going to actually check the status, of course. So if state, we do not have a state. Well, but we do not need a state, I believe. We can represent the state, whether it has been returned or not, just depending on whether there is a non-null returned due at. Non-null returned at. So this is probably all that this return book needs to do. We could have a state. For now, we do not really need it. So we can, for example, expose a function like which would be is overdue, and that's if you haven't returned it, and if also we're now past the return due date. And I'm also going to create this function, which is going to be called is was returned. So this one can be called here. Well, basically just checks if return that is null or not. This way you do not need to make assumption about what return means anywhere outside of the borrowing class. In fact, based on this, what I'm going to do is going to not expose all of the properties everywhere, right? So what we are going to do is, well, okay, we will still want to expose the return that door, but we can think about a better way to do this a bit later. So what we have here at this point is this book. So you can indeed borrow it or you can return it. We're going to have another function that also says declare lost. And this time all it's going to do is moving it to lost. And similarly, yeah, so we just need to get the borrowing or throw, because, well, it would throw if the borrowing doesn't exist. And that's basically, well, actually, never mind. Well, yes, the application passes a borrowing ID, and so that we can only mark a book as lost if there was actually a borrowing which we can find into this book. So again, like, this allows our aggregate to validate that the operation is done for the right reason and not as a result of a bug or a mistake. So declare lost and declare destroyed. There we go. And there again, we want to check that indeed there is a borrowing. So these are going to be, I think, the only functions that we are going to expose at this point on the book object. And so using these methods, these aggregates, we will be able to compose them in the application layer and use them. 1 second. Okay, there's no problem. I think this is just a non-problem. 1 second. Yes, good. And so basically, we're still missing a lot of things here. Essentially, well, I'm not even talking about the application layer, but we're going to need repositories. We are going to need a lot of things, in fact, that just aren't there. So I'm going to go over that quickly. Once again, here I'm going to change things a bit. We're not going to pass a user ID. We're going to pass directly the user. Why? Is because this way we can verify that if the user is banned, then we do not want to let him borrow this book. So again, like, the validation then is on the domain level. And we probably will have another layer of this validation somewhere else, but this allows us to do it at the core, like nothing, no accidental usage, no access from another endpoint, for example, like an operation endpoint or something, from another part of your application, from asynchronous task or whatever, will be able to borrow a book for a user that is banned. And that is actually a very powerful check in that sense. Right. So I'll just go over over how we could do repositories for today, and then that will be all for today. We'll go on the rest of DDD in later episodes. So that will be all for this first session. So that being said, let me create this set book repository. So again, from the requirements, books can be searched by name, author, or ISBN. So that's what we're going to do there. So we're going to have a nested class. Actually, I do not need to declare it as public because it will be by default. We're going to call it book query. Book query is going to contain book name, right? Author ID. And what else did we said? We said that we should be able to search by ISBN. So right, so we're going to also book ISBN. Actually, I'm going to rename this class to just ISBN. I think it's better. So this is my query. Actually, we're going to make it a bit smaller. We do not want to have any. Well, we're going to make this value object. We're going to not make it a record because we do need this. So this is the constructor, and moreover, what it's going to do is check if, yes, exactly that. If all of them are null, then I mean, this is not a valid query, so we're not going to process it further. Again, domain validation at its core. And so what we're going to do here is that we're going to wrap all of the getters into optionals. That's going to be pretty convenient for when we're going to use this repository. So yes, you got this, and that's what we want. Right, so this is the book query, and then the method we're going to expose is going to return a list of book. Sorry, find by, and then book query. So this is very convenient because we only need one single method, and that's the only thing we'll need to implement. So I'll show how to implement it later, of course, once we move to infrastructure, but today that is not the goal. So you will, of course, want a method to save a book, the book aggregate, and we also will want a method that allows us to find a book by ID. And with that said, I think we now got everything in this book repository. So there we go. We got our domain object, the book. We have our book repository. We have our side object as well, so the user ID. We get the nested object borrowing with itself as well, a bunch of domain validation. And we get, well, just author ID for now. So we'll also need, of course, repositories for these other models. But we will do this later. So at this point, we are matching some of the requirements, even though, well, this is not plugged in the application at all. This is just the domain layer. But we do have a catalog of users. They can borrow books from the library. Books can be searched by name, author, and ISBN. The library has a catalog of books. The book can be in several states. available, borrowed, lost, or destroyed. The user can be in several states as well, active or banned. A book, when borrowed, must be returned by a certain date. A late return or no return will force us to ban the user from the library. That we haven't implemented because we have nothing today that can link the book and the user. So here we might want to make this rule an application layer rule, or we might want to make this rule in the domain. We'll get over this next time. And then if the user returns a book after the return date, the book will be reverted back to available. We've actually done this indirectly. If you haven't noticed, return book doesn't care. In fact, if you're returning it late, return book will work whatever, even if you're late, and it will update the status, which works because when the status is available, when we're trying to move the book to available, this also works if the book was marked as lost. So this is convenient. Now, well, of course, the problem here is that we also need, it presupposes that there is a user and that the user is banned already. And that we just haven't implemented, as I said earlier. We haven't put together user and book domains. The last thing is, if the book is returned in the destroyed state, the book will be marked as destroyed, and we have implemented this. So that will be all for today. We'll come back with more episode of this if this is a content that you like. So I would really enjoy feedback on this. This would be really useful, I believe. And so yeah, so next time we'll touch over how to put together not just the book aggregate, but other aggregates. And we'll either go to the application layer or we'll talk about implementation layer. So there's still a lot to be talked to that we should talk about in terms of DDD, of course. But again, this will be for next time. So I will upload this code base to GitHub, and you will be able to have access to it and to study it separately. So with that said, I'll wish you a good rest of the day, and I'll see you next time. So don't forget to like and subscribe, of course. And till next time.